I wanted to make a certain point that has dawned on me over the course of months. There's obviously a relationship between these mandates and tragedies of the past, and anybody who raises that connection is subject to being demonized as somebody who is taking, the deaths of Jews in the Holocaust lightly or something like that. And frankly, I'm having none of it, right? We are in a place where the lessons of the past are directly relevant because we are remaking mistakes that we've seen before. Are we remaking them identically? No. Are we remaking them for the same reasons? Probably not. But are those lessons relevant? And if so, are we liberated to talk about them? We damn well better be. And the point I wanted to make is we are watching the rollback of the Nuremberg Code and the gains made at Nuremberg. And I believe we're seeing it on two separate fronts that are easily conflated because it went down in such a way that they were both in play. One of them has to do with the idea that a human being is morally obligated to reject immoral orders. This is a very important principle. The Nazis who were put on trial at Nuremberg all used the defense that they had been following orders. And the point was the world correctly decided that no such defense was viable, that if the order was immoral, you had an obligation to reject it, even though that's obviously a very dire choice, right? And, let's give the defense its due. Does that mean, in states that have the death penalty, that if somebody tells you, that you are obligated to put somebody to death, that you are obligated to reject it? It's not clear what it means because it's not clear that it's an immoral order. Now, I happen to personally oppose the death penalty. I believe there are cases in which it is morally justified, but that we actually don't have a system good enough to deploy it, and therefore we don't need it. It isn't useful, and we should forbid it. We will be more civilized if we forego it, but it doesn't mean there aren't people who've earned it, right? Right.
You, like I, prefer to make the other error.
I think we have to make the other error. It's the civilized error to make. But in any case, the point is there are lawful orders, potentially, or at least arguably, that do result in a person, going to war. There are wars that are justified and you will kill other people during them. So is it an immoral order just because somebody dies? No, not inherently. But the Nazis' claim to have been following orders was ruled a non-defense.
Right.
Right? Now, we are in the process of purging our police forces, our military, our universities, our hospitals of exactly the people who were most likely to raise objections, people who recognized that there was something wrong with these mandate policies and refused to either apply them to others or to accept them for themselves.
The number of people we've heard from who have nurses in the family, or doctors, but we've heard from more nurses or nurses in the family who are no longer allowed to work in an era when we are also being told that not so much now, but 2 months ago, the hospitals are overflowing.
Right.
We're in crisis mode, and yet we're firing people for making a choice of conscience.
Right. And what I would say is whether it's intentional or not, the consequence of this policy of firing people from police forces, the military, hospitals, universities for resisting is to create police forces, military, universities, hospitals in which people are much less likely to object to immoral orders. And that is hugely dangerous.
You leave behind a compliant population.
Right. But the other way in which we were rolling back Nuremberg is that Nuremberg focused on the medical experiments that were inflicted on victims in concentration camps. Now, what was ruled at Nuremberg was that human beings have a right to informed consent. That is to say that they have to be able to say no to participating in an experiment, and they have to have the basis on which to make the judgment themselves, which means they need to be fully informed. Now, we have pointed out before that these vaccines, mRNA vaccines, for example, are one of probably the largest medical experiment in human history, but for one thing. But for the fact that we are apparently not systematically collecting data on what happened to people who got them and comparing it to people who didn't in order to figure out how dangerous or not they are. So it is an experiment in one sense, in the sense that we don't know, but it is not an experiment in the sense that we are not taking even that responsibility seriously.
Yeah, it's an experiment in the layperson, in the lay sense of experiment, but it's not a scientific experiment.
Right. And if there's one thing we can be certain of, you and I having traversed this ground many times, it's that it is almost impossible to find good information on what the risks are and how common the harms are. And when you do look at what evidence we do have, you're told it's not reliable without being told what is reliable. And so the point is, the informed consent requirement that was established so thoroughly, I mean, we literally hung doctors, right? We hung doctors as a result of those trials, right? That informed consent is now out the window. We are in an experimental phase. There are things that are true based on whether or not the vial that you happen to be injected from is part of the emergency use authorized batch, or whether it is the FDA approved version, and apparently the authorized batch is the only thing you can get in the US. This is a Baroque landscape that no person could possibly understand where their interests actually are and what risks they're being put to. So informed consent is out the window, and those who would object on the basis that they are being asked to apply an experimental remedy to people who have not been informed properly, those people are subject to losing their jobs. And so I don't know if the rolling back of the gains of Nuremberg is intentional, but I do know that it's extremely dangerous. And what I would say is that we are effectively setting the stage for a tragedy of history, and we are obligated to recognize that and to resist with everything we've got.